Management consulting and long working hours. Name a more iconic duo. It's a core aspect of the industry and also one of the most baffling to the non-affiliated. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to best manage your time within the confines of the role. Hello there, Bartosz here. I can hardly count how many conversations I had with consultants regarding their working hours. It's one of those aspects of consulting that is almost unchangeable, the "that's just how it works" mindset, and a big factor leading to stress-related symptoms and other mental health issues. Interestingly enough, the fact that it's unchangeable is one of the reasons why I was motivated to start my own practice. Many of my consultants complained that when they would go to a therapist and explain the situation, all they heard was, "you should work less," which is a natural conclusion for someone with no knowledge of the consulting world, but entirely unhelpful to those who still want to make it work despite the long hours. Here's 5 things to consider when planning your next project to minimize the negative mental effects of working long hours. Number 1, establish your boundaries. One of the most important topics to discuss with your team leader before the project starts is what your boundaries and expectations are. This should ideally take place during a kickoff, but often that part is skipped in favor of just jumping into the trenches. Don't let that happen. Continue to remind them that you want to have a proper kickoff to discuss the team's preferences and needs. Then, during that meeting, be very clear on what you need. Workout or a jog in the morning? A longer break midday, dinner with a close one every once in a while. It's likely that all your needs will not be met, but none will if you don't talk about them. As an example, I had a consultant who, although not happy with working until late in the night on a project, didn't mind the long hours because they had time to work out in the morning and start the day a little later, plus had a proper lunch and dinner break. Another important boundary is your sleep time. It'll be a topic for another video, but the bottom line is the proper amount of sleep is essential for your organism to function properly, so try and not compromise on that front. Number 2, focus on other positives. While working long hours can be taxing, that on its own is very rarely the main issue for many of my consultants. Very often, other aspects of the projects that were very positive outweighed it. Some of the most common examples include an exciting topic that is of interest to the consultant, a supportive and really good team, a client they are excited to work with or that they already worked with before and have a good relationship. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide whether the positives make it worth long hours, and it's also absolutely okay if they don't. Number 3, be transparent with your family or friends. I've seen many of my consultants' personal relationships suffer because of not only the pressure and the fast pace and stress of the job, but also the long hours. I've seen relationships strained when they barely had time for their significant other, parents, or friends. It is very difficult for people outside of the consulting world to understand why we have to work so long. I highly recommend educating your loved ones on how consulting operates so they know what to expect. At the same time, I urge you to understand and respect if that's a deal breaker for them and that you might be forced to choose your priority between continuing your career or finding a more usual, sustainable working environment for the sake of your relationship. Number 4, look for the right location or people. I mentioned already how the right team setup can be a huge positive, so make sure you stay in touch with people you've already worked with who have a working style that suits you so you can work with them in the future and mitigate the negatives. It is no secret that the location of work influences the work-life balance. It is common knowledge, at least in McKinsey, that the Nordic-based projects with the Nordic clients and leadership have statistically the best work-life balance not only in Europe but globally. If you can influence where you work, which is not always the case, it can also help with managing the long hours. That being said, with cultural and local differences, there also come different expectations. For example, for someone who worked primarily outside of the Nordics, our work-life balance here might sound like a paradise, but for someone who worked here all the time, it is absolutely valid if they still decide that the working hours are too much, which leads me to the last point. Number 5, if all else fails, well, it is possible that despite the previous 4 tips, you still feel like the long hours requirement is absolutely unacceptable, and that is totally okay. This aspect of consulting world is definitely what I would call a legacy feature. I often heard from our senior leadership that back in the day they worked until 4 a.m. every day and nobody complained. We just sucked it up and did the job. But for me personally, that is not a valid excuse, as we have changed significantly since then as a society. It is definitely also a generational change, but nowadays a healthy work-life balance is a top-tier priority for many people who are not willing to compromise on that front, but still want to work in consulting. To those of you who struggle with it, I say this: compromise where you can, but where you can't, don't. If you want more sustainable working hours, there's a multitude of opportunities outside of consulting that will be stimulating and rewarding without expecting you to work 24/7. You have to understand the corporate perspective. No matter how much they speak about the people angle and its importance, the primary goal of any corporation is to make money, which for consulting translates into satisfied clients, and that will always be their priority. These are my 5 tips on how to address long hours expected of you in the consulting world. As always, there are many unique factors to consider when deciding whether the time sacrifice is worth it, and I'll leave it to each of you individually. That being said, I hope these hints will help you think through and come to your own conclusions. Of course, if you'd like to discuss your specific circumstances or if there are any other issues I could help with, feel free to check my website for available slots and book the earliest one that works for you. If you cannot find a suitable time, you can send me an email and I will see if I can accommodate your schedule. That's all for today. If you made it all the way to the end, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my content. Also, let me know in the comments what other topics you'd like me to tackle. Until then, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!